and welcome. Now, this evening has developed into a very interesting event. When I started negotiating with John Ostrowick some weeks ago, we were uncertain as to what we would focus on. But it's turned out he's got some slides on free will. So that's how we will start out, and the conversation will develop in many different directions following that, I expect. And of course, your questions and comments will be welcome too. Now, free will, of course, is something which this guy, Sam Harris, has focused a book on. And he's become very expensive nowadays. You've got to pay a lot of money to listen to him, whether you go and see him live or take his videos. And the other guy who's very famous in the field of free will, of course, is Dan Dennett. And I'm very pleased to be able to tell you that next year, he's busy at the moment, but next year, Dan has agreed to come on the show. Meanwhile, tonight, we have John Ostrowick in South Africa. Hello, John. How the devil are you?
I'm all right, thanks. Yourself?
Good, good. Yes, I'm fine too. Thank you.
Are you picking up my audio?
Yes, I don't.
Let me put it a bit closer here.
Yes, we get your
Good.
sound.
So I'll start.
You're coming in there.
I'll start by apologizing for the accent. I won't be doing too much Leonardo DiCaprio from Blood Diamond. Hopefully.
Well, we've got some South Africans in our audience tonight. So I don't know. Maybe some actually in South Africa, but I know there's a couple of South Africans who are now resident in the UK who will be viewing. And I think
let's go to the presentation outline, slide 2. All right, thank you. So the general structure, we're going to look at some terminology. What is theodicy? Free will debate, scientific evidence about free will, and some conclusions for religion. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Right, so there we've got terminology, philosophy of mind. It's the area of philosophy that deals with nature of mind. Theodicy, that is that God allows evil for reasons. Free will, that we can choose to do whatever we want to do. Determinism, that everything is caused. And then we've got 3 positions in the philosophy literature on free will, which is libertarianism, compatibilism, hard determinism, and quantum mechanics. And if you look at those sort of positions, what they do is they try to cover what model of free will is viable. So the libertarian model says that we have free will and determinism is false. Compatibilism says we have free will despite determinism. And hard determinism says that we don't have free will. Quantum mechanics is used as an explanation for free will in the libertarian model. Lastly, the term fMRI, which I'll also use as a form of imaging of the brain. They will give you some sort of glucose, and then they pick up emissions from the glucose and the brain usage of the glucose, and they display it on a screen so that you can see what areas of your brain light up when you do certain things in your brain, like think or move your body parts. It stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. All right, so just to go into theodicy, so there's a bunch of models of theodicy or types of theodicy. You get soul-making theodicy, which is where you'd say something like evil exists so that you can be a martyr, or so you can suffer and improve your personality by going through suffering. You've got another model which says, well, it gives you opportunities to combat evil and therefore be a hero. You get opportunities like it gives you a choice to be free, and therefore if you didn't have evil, you wouldn't be able to choose between good and evil, so you wouldn't really have free choice. You get a model that says that it gives you the opportunity to learn consequences of evil, so it's a learning exercise. So for example, there we think of God as a good parent, so we say stuff like, well, you know, a good parent will allow a child at some certain age to play with matches or use a cell phone or whatever. And the idea is that a good parent will give a child limited freedom with possible risks in order to teach the child how to handle those risks. And then, of course, there's the skeptical theist argument, which says that we're just such limited beings compared to God that we can't possibly know what his reasons are for evil. So we've got the Isaiah 55:5-9, which is famously quoted by Rowan Atkinson in Keeping Mum, where he says, "My ways are not your ways." And that's one of the theistic answers for why there's evil. We just don't know what God's plans are. There are problems with all of these. I don't want to go into them. What I want to focus on is the free will theodicy, which is a very common one. So you say to believers, well, why does God allow evil? He's all powerful, so he should stop it. He's all good, so he shouldn't allow evil in the first place. So why does he allow evil if he's all powerful, can stop it, and is all good and shouldn't allow it in the first place? And the answer that they typically give is, well, you've got free choice, and God gave you free choice. So unless he gave you that free choice, you wouldn't be able to do evil. So evil exists because humans choose to do evil. There's a whole bunch of problems with that. I don't want to go into those problems in detail. What I'd rather do is focus on the question of whether we have free will at all. So the free will debate has got these three main sort of takes on it. You'll see that the headings say libertarianism, hard determinism, compatibilism. I've given some examples of authors there. So this diagram below, which I've pilfered off internet, and unfortunately I can't remember who created it. I'll have to search for it again. Probably falls under fair use anyway. So determinism. So determinism is the view that everything has a cause and the cause necessitates the effect. So for example, gravity necessitates that things fall down. You can't escape gravity. Even if you put a huge payload and a rocket with massive amount of fuel, you're still fighting against gravity. You still have to expend energy to fight against gravity. So deterministically, you have to use force to get away from the planet. So cause and effect is the model of determinism. So if determinism is true, then the question comes up, well, what if your personality causes your behavior? And what if your parenting and how you were brought up causes your behavior? What if your genetics cause your behavior? It's very notable in psychology. They talk about nature versus nurture. They say, well, do people have pathologies because of how they were brought up, or do people have pathologies because of genetics? But those are deterministic positions. They're not giving you a free choice about the matter. Nobody in psychology ever says, well, you chose to be schizophrenic, or you chose to have a antisocial personality disorder or whatever. So it's still a deterministic model where you don't have a choice about how your personality is and therefore how you behave, which is what is called pathological behavior. So it looks, if you look at the sort of causal model of behavior, it looks like you don't really have much choice. But then you still hear in almost every American movie, well, your God-given free will. What is free will? What does that mean? And if you ask people to spell this out, they usually will say stuff like, well, I can choose to do what I want to do. But that's clearly not true, right? I mean, if you live in a sort of an arid region of the Sahel or somewhere in Ethiopia, say, you might not be aware of something like the space shuttle or a Boeing 747. You might not be aware of these things. So you can't want to be an astronaut or a pilot if you haven't ever seen such a thing as a space shuttle or a Boeing. So, your choices about what constitutes being free are limited by your knowledge, and that's what we call the compatibilist position, but I'll get onto that in a second. However, there's an intuition one can have that background, upbringing, circumstances you find yourself in can limit your choices. The question is, do they eradicate your choices? So the question then is, do you have free will? And as I've said, there's three models here. So you've got what are called incompatibilist models and compatibilist models. So your incompatibilist model says, free will is incompatible with determinism, and your compatibilist model says no, free will is compatible with determinism. So under incompatibilism, there's two forms: libertarianism, which says determinism is false, and hard determinism, which says determinism is true, and therefore there's no free will. So just to give a simple example, a libertarian would say that if you steal something from a shop, you freely chose to do that and you should go to jail. A hard determinist would say if you stole something from a shop, it was probably because of the way you were brought up, and you should probably therefore maybe go for rehabilitation or just be forgiven. And a compatibilist would say, well, you had the knowledge that it was wrong to steal and you still chose to do it, so maybe you should go to jail, even though you had a bad upbringing, and maybe you can go for rehab. So you can see a compatibilist position is more or less in between the two. The difference is a compatibilist position will accept that there is determinism. Libertarian position is quite an interesting one. It usually will make use of quantum mechanics, and it will usually claim that quantum mechanics gives you freedom because there's no such thing as determinism. So for those of you not familiar with it, quantum mechanics is the science of subatomic particles, and it claims that there is no cause and effect, really. So you're looking at the issue of what happens at a subatomic particle and level, and at first was sort of put forward as a model of its subatomic particles when radioactivity was noted as a phenomenon, and it was asked, well, why do radioactive particles randomly jump out of matter? What causes that? And the general position is that it's just random. It really is random. So if you look at the doctrine of libertarianism, the problem with it is really that it's not actually putting control back in the hand of the agent. So if you even say that, say, your neurons in your brain, which cause your bodily emotions, are ultimately caused to do whatever they do in virtue of quantum events, you're not putting control back in the agent's hands, because you're not giving the agent control over those quantum events, because remember, they're truly random, and you certainly can't control quantum events that happen in your neurons at an atomic level. So there's a guy called Kane who was writing in the late 90s who argues that, well, your will overcomes the noise generated by the quantum events, and I don't think that works for a range of reasons that I don't want to go into because we're time limited here. But I don't think it really works. So that leaves us with hard determinism and compatibilism. So let me rather talk about compatibilism and why I don't buy it. Compatibilism will usually say something like, you're free as long as you get what you want because you wanted it. And my problem with that is when you make an innocent mistake. So you might, for example, think that a person freely chooses to do an action, but then how do they make a mistake? Because in order to really want something, you have to know what the consequences of that action are going to be. And if you really know, as Plato says, what the consequences are going to be, and you know they're going to be bad consequences, you won't do that action. So it's hard to have a kind of a knowledge-based view of free will, where your free will is informed by what you know, what you believe, and what you want. If you have room for mistakes, right? So you could misjudge the information, and yet still we think freely choose to do something wrong. So compatibilism, I don't think really works. I think it's wordplay, as I indicate there, because I think there's a sense in which we believe that you get given a scenario where you asked, could you have done otherwise, and there's a huge debate about this in philosophy of mind, which is, does free will require the ability to do otherwise? Some compatibilists say no, some say yes. Hard determinists and libertarians say no. You need to be able to do otherwise. So we often say things like, were I to live my life over, I wouldn't have done that. I regret that. But if you look at causal determinism and how your life was caused, and there was a series of events that led you to where you were, revising your steps in your life wouldn't really be possible unless antecedents to yourself were revised. So this is, of course, one of the problems with, say, time travel stories, because if you mess with the past, you change the future, right? So that is, in fact, what makes time paradoxes paradoxical, is that you can't mess with the past. So, could you go back in the past and kill your own grandfather, say? So those are the sort of problems that come up as a result of believing you can change the causal, the arrow of time, the causal direction. So, I mean, one can still step back and say, well, quantum mechanics seems to be true based on what we see of current research in quantum mechanics, where we're seeing quantum entanglement and all these fancy things. Well, yes, but the question is, does it magnify up to the macroscopic level? Yes, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, we don't know. But even so, that wouldn't preserve free will. What that would do is preserve randomness. It would make your actions truly random rather than, say, chaotic in the mathematical sense. So the next bunch of questions there that I want people to just think about, and I don't want to go into them in details, is if we lose free will because we've eliminated compatibilism and libertarianism, what does it do for spontaneity, moral responsibility, creativity, and those sort of things in the face of hard determinism? So if, for example, everything we do is caused, can we really say we're doing something spontaneous? Can we really say we're doing something morally responsible? Can we really say we're doing something creative? My answer to all of those is no, but I don't want to go into those because we're talking about God here. What I'd rather do is go on to the next slide. And on the next slide, we see some interesting graphs. Those are my graphs. They're simplified versions of the graphs that are referenced. So you'll see there's some references there to a work by a guy called Benjamin Libet, who was writing in the 1980s. So he discovered there's this thing called the readiness potential, which occurs in the brain. It's a kind of a ramping up of the voltage in the brain just before you do a bodily motion. And if you look at these graphs, you'll see there's a V, a W, and a figure of minus 0.55, a figure of minus 0.2, and a 0 point. And you'll see there's a vertical y-axis RP, that's the readiness potential, or the voltage. So when an action occurs, the RP ramps up. It starts at about minus 0.55 seconds. It ramps up and then it drops down after the action occurs. And I think that subjectively you can kind of feel this, like just before you get up off the couch. You feel your body sort of tingle or whatever, like you're ready to move. And then the next graph you see there's called veto, and that's where you change your mind. Now what's really interesting about these graphs is if you look at the W point there, where it's at minus 0.02, that's where you become consciously aware of your will or your choice. But the point is, and this is what makes it a bit so scary, is that the brain starts doing stuff before you're aware of it at minus 0.55. And the same happens with the veto case. So the veto position, you become aware of at minus 0.15, but the brain action started long before that. So even if you do change your mind in what we think of as exercising of free will, it still all starts before you're aware of it. And I've got a paper on this where I argue about Libet's interpretation, because he thinks veto is free will. I think it's not. And there's been subsequent work by some guys, Soon and Hayes, in 2008, which did fMRI. So they did brain scans instead of using ECG or EEG, which was what Libet was using. And Soon and Hayes show that the brain activities can actually start as early as 10 seconds before. 10 seconds before. Meaning that you're not aware of your choices up to 10 seconds before you actually commit them. So for me, that's devastating to free will, because it means that everything you choose to do is non-conscious or unconscious. In other words, Freud was basically right. The subconscious is what's driving us. So if we look at this graph here that I've put here, this seems to illustrate, sorry, on the next slide, this seems to illustrate what's actually happening is that you have an RP the readiness potential or some brain activity that you're not aware of. It causes a side effect of an experience of volition W. It sends a signal to the motor cortex M, which is what actually causes the action. So those two things might be simultaneous, the M and the W, but the point is they're not causally linked. And that has devastating implications for law, it has devastating implications for psychology. It's a very interesting area of research. There's a vast amount of research being done on this. There's a guy called Gatsanika, there's a lot of researchers on this area. I can give people references via John another time. But there's a whole bunch of implications that come out of this, and the one is that very clearly, if this is correct, there's no such thing as free will. And we'll see what that does to religion afterwards. But if we go to the next slide, we'll see that the situation is actually much worse. So there's a whole bunch of debates in philosophy of mind about whether the mind is just the brain, and whether it's just activities of the brain, and whether we're automata, and whether we could potentially, for example, create an AI which is conscious. So we see this, for example, in the film, I think it's Deus Ex Machina or something like that, where there's this android who fools this guy into believing that she's a real person, and he falls in love with her. If it's possible, and if the brain is in fact just a kind of a computer, an organic computer, that also has devastating implications for religion, and I want to talk about why. But before I do that, what I want to do is I want to talk about these 10 different models of consciousness and what is consciousness. And the reason I want to talk about those is because I think intuitively we all think that we are our consciousness and we are separate somehow from our body. So this is called the brain, the ghost in the machine is, I think, how Descartes styled it. We often think of ourselves as kind of a spook that controls a body. And when we die, of course, the spook parts and goes off into meeting God or joins the universal consciousness or something like that. And this is depicted in popular culture, right? So, you know, Snape is being killed by the Dementors and he's lying at the side of the lake, and the Dementors are flying over him, and they're sucking his soul out, and a little soul pearl of light comes out of his mouth. I mean, this kind of depiction of the spirit or the soul or the mind or the self or the personhood of a person is very commonly depicted as a kind of a living force that can be separated from the body. And in fact, the ancients thought of it that way, which is why we call it a spirit, because it's Latin spiritu, to breathe, spirito, I breathe, spiro. Even in Hawaii, breath is, I think it's ole or something like that. So hence the concept of a spirit is associated with the breath. We talk about asthmatics, right? So an asthmatic is somebody who struggles to breathe. In Hindu culture, the Atman, a similar word to asthma, in the Indo-European language group, refers to breath. So what we're talking about here really is the religious model of the mind, which is what we call dualism, that there's two types of stuff. There's spirit stuff, the Holy Spirit, God, angels, demons, souls. And then there's crude stuff or matter, the body. And we see this in, say, Gnosticism, the predecessor of Christianity, where the body and the mind are separate things. The body is to be despised, the soul is the pure thing, and you must nurture the soul. So nowadays, in the 21st century, we now have these sort of 10 models I've listed here. Epiphenomenalism. I think Dennett probably falls under this category, so Dennett's an atheist writer. I'm sympathetic to epiphenomenalism. It's the view that the mind is kind of an after effect of neural activity. It's not the driver or cause. So like traffic is a epiphenomenon of cars, or shadows are an epiphenomenon of light and bodies. And then there's supervenience, which I think John Searle subscribes to. That's where your mind is a kind of a field or something that sits on top of the brain. It's kind of separate to, but caused by, and might have a functional role in it. Then there's functionalism, which underlies the assumptions of artificial intelligence. This is, for example, Lewis. Functionalism talks about how as long as something functions as a mind, it is a mind. So the famous thought experiment from Lewis is an article called Mad Pain and Martian Pain, where he talks about if you find a Martian on Mars and he has a hydraulic brain, do you want to deny that he's conscious? Well, probably not, because he acts as if he's in pain when you stamp on his foot. But he doesn't have neurons like we have neurons, so he has a functioning nervous system of sorts, but they're not like ours. So a functionalist will argue that as long as something functions as a brain, acts as a brain, it can give rise to consciousness. So there are all kinds of interesting spin-offs on that. So you get, for example, panpsychism, which I'll talk about a bit lower down. Eliminativism, that's Churchland, Patricia Churchland. So there is no such thing as a mind. It's just activities of the brain. We're deluding ourselves in thinking that we're conscious. It's a bit of a crude way of expressing Churchland's view, but that's roughly the gist of it. Then there's central state materialism. Armstrong, I think he was writing in about 1968. There, the mind is just functions and states of the brain. So that's similar to supervenience, but it's making them inseparable. Dualism, which we've discussed, that's the soul or spirit is separate to the body. So your brain could die and your spirit could live on. Extended mind theory, that's a very new one. That's Andy Clark from Edinburgh University. Chalmers used to be a dualist. He's now moved into extended mind, I believe. Extended mind you can think of as a bit like a hive mind concept. It's where there's nothing special about your brain in particular that should make it you. You could extend your mind into other things. So society, Facebook, your phone. It becomes part of your mind. I'm sympathetic to this view as well, but I think it's probably pushing a metaphor too far. Again, I think my nuance isn't good enough here to really do it credit without straw manning it. So I don't want to criticize any of these positions except possibly dualism. Panpsychism, so that's the view that there's souls or minds in everything. Now there's a version of panpsychism which is plausible, and that's pantheism. So if you for example take functionalism as true, that anything could be a mind as long as it's suitably complex and transmits information, then you can look at stuff like gravity waves as functionally equivalent to a mind, and you can talk about a universal mind. So I've got a paper on this as well. I don't think it works, but it's at least scientifically plausible. And then we've got emergence, which I think Dennett might be sympathetic to. There are a few others who are sympathetic to it. I'm very sympathetic to emergence. So emergence and epiphenomenalism are very similar. I don't want to try and tease out the difference here. Emergence applies to any phenomena, not just the mind. It's so solidness in matter emerges from swarms of atoms, for example. So tables aren't actually solid, they're just swarms of atoms. That's an example of emergence. So the mind emerges as a side effect of or as a feature of the brain. So consciousness emerges as a property of neural activity. Lastly, there's a very interesting view that an acquaintance of mine raised with me recently, which is a temporal model, and that is that time is consciousness, or consciousness is time. I haven't given much thought to this position, so I'm not sure how plausible it is or how it could be unpacked. But I thought it was a very exciting idea, so I put it there as a fun bullet to think about. However, the next bullet here, the last bullet I want to talk about, is that if 1 to 5 are true, or 9 is true, So if any of what we call the materialist positions, that is that there's no such thing as spirit, there's only matter, if any materialist position is true, religion's false. And let me give some demonstrations of this. So on the next slide, John, thanks. The next slide, we see a very exciting picture from Kamitani Lab in Japan. The reference is at the bottom on bioRxiv. So what these guys did is they used fMRI and they trained some AI to analyze the outputs of the fMRI scans. And they trained the AI to recognize the brain patterns of particular experimental subjects looking at particular pictures. And after a while, they got to a point where, as you can see from the second and third rows, the computer could pull images from the human mind. In other words, the AI could say this person's looking at an animal, it's looking at a post box, it's looking at a stained glass window, etc. As you can see, the images are not great, but it's pretty impressive considering it's literally just pulled from an fMRI scan. In other words, mind reading is now becoming a reality, and for me this is pretty terrifying. What's even more terrifying is that just this year they've achieved the same with word recognition, so they can now read your mind if you're thinking in words. Conclusions. Next slide, please, John. So conclusion 1 on free will. If there's no free will, there's no free will theodicy, and then God just allows evil, which means either God doesn't exist or God is not entirely good. You could go down Alvin Plantinga's route, sorry, I've spelled his name wrong there, and go for a free will defense where evil is allowed by God as long as there are good reasons for God to allow evil. But we've already discussed that under the various other theodicies, and I've indicated that I reject all of those theodicies for various reasons. I don't want to go into Plantinga too much. Again, I don't want to go into a very nuanced discussion of him. It goes on quite long. It involves Bayes' theorem and so on. What I'd rather just say is that you have to come up with a very, very good reason to argue that there is evil and a perfectly good God. And free will definitely doesn't support you. The second conclusion I want to draw on the next slide, and that next slide shows some fMRI scans if you've never seen them, is that the biggest threat to religion is in fact the nature of the mind, and fMRI suggests that the mind is merely physical. And if the mind is just physical, then it demonstrates that religion is false. Why does it do this? Because religion depends on the existence of a big soul, which we call God, and small souls, which we call the souls, unless you want to try and distinguish the soul and the mind and say the soul and the mind are not the same thing. But if you want to go that route, which some people, by the way, do, then you have to answer the question of differentiation. All right? So I'm possibly a bad person because I might remember in Christian theology, for example, that I've committed certain sins. And those certain sins adhere to me in virtue of the fact that I remember them. I chose consciously to perform them, and so on. If you don't distinguish persons on the basis of their minds and their mental content, but on their souls, and the soul is not the mind, then you can't differentiate my soul from your soul, because there's no unique properties of my soul if it's not containing my memories, or my choices, or my personality. Yet we think of personality, choices, memory, and those sort of things as mental properties of minds, not of souls. Souls we just think of as being these sort of immortal ghosts, like we saw coming out of Snape's mouth. But I mean, what do the Dementors suck out? They suck out memories, right? Until your soul pops out. So I think to differentiate the soul from the mind is a waste of time, unless there's a theologian in the audience who can make good on that. So what that does is it means that we're trapped. We've got to accept that either the mind is physical or fMRI is not really showing us activities of the mind, it's showing something else. And we're not in fact reading the mind, which I think we're pretty clear that we do, using that Kamitani Lab example. So if the mind is in fact physical, then there can't be small souls, and if there aren't small souls, there's very little reason to believe there's a big one called God, unless, for example, panpsychism or pantheism is true, for which see my other writings. But there's another question, which is, can we instantiate a mind? So we're currently looking at AI, and those pictures drawn from minds were drawn by AIs, looking at patterns in the mind. And if you can instantiate an AI, then you've got a plausible case of an artificial mind, right? The only question, and this is the real tricky question, is are we instantiating or are we simulating, right? So does it just act like a mind, or is it really a mind? And how do we know if it's really a mind? Well, it has to have subjective experiences. There has to be something that it's like to be an AI, right? So there's a very famous paper by, what's his name now? Thomas Nagel. What is it like to be a bat? And I think it's a very powerful paper because it makes this point. As human beings, we don't know how it feels to be a bat. And because we don't know how it feels to be a bat, we can't deny that there's something that it's like to be a bat. So there should be something it's like to be an AI. A computer should be able to describe to it how it feels qualitatively, what it's like to be a computer. If that's possible, and if a computer can do it without prior programming, so we don't tell the computer what to say, then I think we would have instantiated a mind. And if we do that, then we've definitely proven the mind is physical. But until such time, I don't think we've proven it. I think we've got strong indications that the mind is physical. And if that is true, then religion must be false. Thank you.
Let's see what's coming in on the comment bank. Wow, we've got lots. What do you mean by human? This is Ashish Yadav. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. What do you mean by human? As opposed to a brain in a vat? Is that what he's getting at, do you think?
I'm not sure. It could be. I mean, for me, it's a good question. So the typical religious answer would be something like a human is a thing that has a soul. But I'm not species biased on that one. I think my cat, if I have a soul, my cat certainly has one. He definitely has a personality. He definitely acts like he has a personality. He definitely plans to strike me from behind a door. So he hides behind the door and waits for me to come past, and then he jumps out and attacks me. So that sort of behavior strikes me as planned, strikes me as conscious behavior. If I look at, for example, something as crude as saltaceae, okay, jumping spiders, the very small spiders you find on window ledges. You put your finger in front of that thing, it looks at your finger, it looks up at you, it looks at your finger, and if you move your finger forward, it jumps backwards. So it's definitely conscious. It's definitely conscious. Whether it's conscious of itself as existing as an individual, that's a different question. But it's definitely aware that there's some existence beyond itself. It's definitely aware that there's a threat. So I think that there's a grade of consciousness, and I think the grade of consciousness is proportional to brain complexity. So I think a chimp is probably about as conscious as we are, because they're 98% genetically identical.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a spider is probably minimally conscious, like it's aware of light and dark, it's aware of threats. But I don't think it knows that it exists. Yes. So there's a very famous test, which is the mirror test, right? So you put an animal in front of a mirror, and if it touches itself, then it's self-aware. If it touches the mirror, it thinks the mirror is another animal. And I think the animals that pass this are your apes, dogs, elephants, and I think crows. I think crows pass it as well.
And the cetaceans.
Well, I'm not aware of cetaceans being subjected to the mirror test, but I wouldn't be surprised if they passed it.
Yes, sometimes
so to answer the question of
don't they?
Sorry,
They put a
yeah, they
paint
put a
blob
spot
on
of
the.
paint on. Yeah, they put a paint blob on the creature, and then it touches itself to get rid of
Yeah.
the paint blob. So to answer the question of what makes you human, well, I think there's different answers to that, right? So I would say culture is one thing. So humans have definite culture, which we don't really see in other animals. There's some indication of primitive culture signs in some troops of chimps in the Congo that I've seen research on, where they were witnessed doing ritual dances and throwing rocks at a tree, all throwing rocks at the
Yes.
same tree. So
Mm.
that's an indication of some proto-religious behavior in the chimps. But I wouldn't say
Yeah.
that they had a culture per se. Furthermore, if you look at, for example, the evidence of Neanderthals who buried their dead with red ochre in fetal positions with grave goods, we don't call Neanderthals fully human. They're like a predecessor, right? And yet they display
Yeah.
culture. So even the question of culture is a bit dubious. I mean, it's a very good marker of humanness or humanity, but it's not the sine qua non. And I just consider religion to be a form of culture. It's part of culture. So I'm not saying religion must go. I'm just saying it's cultural, and I think that's one of the big markers of humans. There are many other markers. Our technology is vastly more advanced than any other creature. So chimps use spear.
If you include communication in culture, there's also been some results of investigations about birds having different dialects, same
Right.
species, but different dialects from different locations.
Yeah. So I don't buy the language is human thing, because I think that it's very hard to define language beyond communication, or saying it's just communication.
Mm.
Because you do get evidence of understanding syntax, for example, in greater apes when you teach them to use sign language. They do seem to
Yes.
understand syntax. So I'm not buying that either. I would say culture is probably the best marker, but beyond that, nothing really. I think humans are just creatures, and creatures have minds, and minds are more or complex or less complex according to how complex the creature is. So. And I think that your ethical importance, the ethical value of a creature is probably also proportional to its mental complexity. So, hence, we don't feel too bad generally about eating, say, chickens, but we feel terrible about eating dolphins because we recognize this one's superior, it's more intelligent. It's why we have an
Mm.
abhorrence of cannibalism, say. So I think the moral question that comes out of religion also relates to intelligence, culture, and so on. It's not really a religious thing.
You see this other question here? How do we know these fMRI studies aren't simply reporting on what neurons of the visual cortex are signaling rather than what a person is experiencing or thinking?
Well, the answer to that is that is in fact what they're reporting. However, you can correlate them with images, right? And the images that you see there are generated by what are called generative adversarial networks. They're AIs that compete with each other for the most realistic presentation of what the neural correlate is of the relevant image. So it's not that you've somewhere in your neuron you've got a picture and the electricity is conveying the picture like a television signal. That's not it at all. So in philosophy of mind we talk about neural correlates. So what is the neural correlate of pain? Well, it's a C-type nerve that's firing. So saying a C fiber firing in the brain doesn't mean what it feels like to feel pain, just as these visual cortex neurons firing doesn't convey what it's like to see those images, but those are in fact the neural correlates of those images. So what it does demonstrate is that the brain is where consciousness resides, and therefore where the soul resides. That's enough.
So you mentioned early on
Yeah.
about us being unable to choose a psychological condition.
Yeah.
You mentioned that we cannot be held responsible for our own pathology.
Yeah.
But about method acting? You know, when somebody does method acting,
Sure.
they use their memories of an experience to recreate that experience, and I'm sure that generates the same sort of hormonal response in their body while they're doing
Correct.
it, as if it was a real activity.
Correct. So that's fine. So I was giving a very crude exposition of the various positions on free will, because this isn't a formal philosophy lecture, and
No.
I didn't want to bore the audience with very heavy technical detail.
Yes.
On
Yes.
that particular point, when I say you can't really choose your psychological states, I'm referring to specifically the case of, say, pathology, where I think that if you look at, say, schizophrenia, you can't say to a schizophrenic, well, choose to not be schizophrenic. It is, in fact, a kind of a brain malfunction that has a visible sign on an MRI. You can see it, okay? So that's a very serious issue. It's not something you just sort of choose. So when it comes to other mental states, like somebody might say to you, for example, well, just cheer up, or well, why don't you just choose to not be depressed, or surely you can choose to not have OCD.
Yes.
You can stop sorting those things on the table. You don't have to sort them. I mean, the force of pathology is, it doesn't work. And the force of pathology is such that people can't get away from it easily. Hence the need for psychotherapy. And what psychotherapy does, depending on the model, is it breaks down that neural pattern that causes the repeating behavior. Whether you go for a cognitive behavioral model, whether you go for a behaviorist model, whether you go for a Freudian model, it doesn't matter which model of psychotherapy you want to talk about. Ultimately, it boils down to breaking that repeat. And that's an external force that's got to come from the therapist. It's not endogenous. It's not going to happen spontaneously unless you yourself, for example, go read a book on psychotherapy and then look at, well, this book says I must do this. It's still an exogenous source. You're looking at a book. You're doing some behaviors. You're seeing your body doing certain behaviors. You're seeing you changing your behaviors. So there's also a kind of a chicken and egg problem around you, right? So you talk about the acting case, right? So is it you who's choosing to method act, or is it your previous experiences choosing for you? I mean, what are you? Are you the sum of your experiences? Are you the sum of your memories? Are you the soul pearl? Are you the ghost in the machine? What are you? What does you mean? So what's really interesting about that one is you look at commiserotomy operations. So I think it was the 1950s where it was quite popular with epileptics to cut the commissures, which is the circuitry joining the two halves of the brain. The idea was that if you got an epileptic storm in the brain, it would hit only one side, so only one part of your body would go crazy. The trouble with that was it had weird side effects. You started to see actions from persons who'd had that op as if there were two persons in the skull. So one hand will pull down the pants, the other hand will pull up the pants. One hand will write, and the other hand won't know what was written, that kind of thing. Or the other side of the brain won't know what is written. So the person can write something, but they can't say what they wrote. Those kind of weird effects, because the consciousness has been split. So it's very clear that our brain's a bunch of subsystems that are joined, and they aren't in fact aware of what they're doing, which is what the Libet stuff shows as well. It shows that your motor cortex at least can initiate an action without you being aware of it. And that's necessary, right? Because if you think about how slow you are playing chess, imagine you had to drive a car at chess playing speed, you would die. You have to be able to dodge potholes and pedestrians and so on in order to not die steering a car. And those decisions in a car are in the order of 50 milliseconds, whereas a speech act is sort of 250 milliseconds. It's 5 times slower. So when you're thinking in your head, I'm going to do this, I'm planning to do that tomorrow, those are all mental speech acts in your speech cortex. They're not actual consciousness plans for your motor cortex to do tomorrow. It's just you're talking to yourself. Okay. You've shut off your voice cords, but it's still the vocal cortex working.
Yes.
So if you were to plan while you were driving, can you imagine? Oh, there's a pedestrian. I must steer to avoid them, by which time they're dead.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so this is why a person can pull off a starting block in a race in 50 milliseconds. But if you ask them what muscles they're kicking and which muscle they're flexing, they can't answer that without thinking about it for a few minutes.
Mm.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of stuff is already a program that we just press go on.
And another example is tying your shoelaces, right? You don't think loop one, turn it, fold it over, tie a knot. You just do it.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, have you ever driven home by mistake when you set off to go somewhere else?
Absolutely.
But you're
Absolutely. Yeah.
You're also taking you
autopilot.
home. And
autopilot's very important. It's a very important thing, autopilot. You wouldn't be able to have a conversation in a car if you wouldn't be able to use the GPS, etc., etc. All kinds of things would fail if you couldn't do autopilot.
Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So the hard determinist position in something like method acting would be that, well, you're just remembering previous events over which you had no control, where you had an emotive response. And you know that by having that memory being recalled and brought forward, it will have that same emotive response. Your director of the movie has told you, I want you to be sad. So you remember the time your puppy died. So you remember the memory of your puppy dying. It makes you sad. You cry for the director, and he's like, yeah, you chose to cry. No, you didn't choose to cry. You just remembered a sad memory because you were requested by the exogenous source, the director who's paying your salary. It's not up to you.
Yes. So I don't know. I think we're coming. I know you've got another thing to go to, haven't you? At the
well, it's in our part of the world. It's bedtime. It's 10 o'clock here.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes,
and I have work to go to tomorrow. But
yes.
I'm happy to answer another, say, 2 or 3 questions.
Okay, we'll give you 2 or 3 more questions then. Thank you. I'd like to investigate that that passage where you explain that one option is to consider retrospective free will not to be available. So time travel is ruled out. Revising is not possible, which rules out one type of free will, which is the type where it's assumed that you could have done differently. That type of free will, that's ruled out if you accept that you can't retrospectively alter something. So what does that argue for determinism?
Yeah, that's a deterministic position. It's also quite a linear view of time, where time only goes in one direction. There's a whole philosophy of time, which I'm not up to speed on the literature of, so I don't want to go into that too much. What I could comment on there is the general position of could have done otherwise. So the best way to cash this out is to talk about lighting a match. So you can talk about hypotheticals, or I forget the technical term now. There's a linguistics term where you say, if I were to strike the match, it would have lit. So in some hypothetical other scenario, conditional, so were the situation otherwise, I would have chosen something else. Were I have struck the match, it would have lit. So that's the logical form of it. Now that's okay, but it's still not going to preserve free will, because what it's going to do is just say the determinants were different. Because as long as the antecedents before the striking of the match exist, you just are never going to realize that hypothetical alternative universe in which you strike the match. It's just never going to happen, because it's guaranteed in virtue of prior states of the world.
Even if you could wind time back to that instant, all of the other factors
Yeah.
in the universe will be different.
Those other factors have to be different to guarantee a different outcome. And the only way that that could change is if chaos applies in that circumstance in the mathematical sense. So the so-called butterfly effect, that might take place. But then again, it would be antecedent causes. It wouldn't be because you chose. It should be that your mind was in a chaotic state, right? Or that the antecedent causes were in a chaotic state. So you might choose to cross a road, say, choose in inverted commas, and due to the chaotic state of the world, the traffic pattern might be different and you might get run over this time. And you could say, well, if I hadn't chosen to cross the road, I wouldn't have gotten run over. That's a nice hypothetical, but the point is the state of the world prior to you stepping off the pavement is what determined whether you got hit by a car or not. Plus your ability to observe whether there were cars, all those other factors.
But I like this bit about if there is no free will, it's a kibosh to a lot of religion, because it takes away responsibility for crime, for sin, for evilness, whatever those things mean, because we've got no definitions. It means there's no possibility of forgiveness. There's no possibility of recidivism.
That's probably an exaggeration, to be honest. So I think you're probably running a bit far ahead there. So it depends on which religion you're talking about, right? So if we look at, say, Taoism or Confucianism, they've got very different moral systems. They've got exemplar moral systems, like the ancient Greek arete. So in Aristotle's time, he would talk about a virtuous man does this. And in Confucianism, it's what's the word? The filial son will do this. He will obey his father. He will go to work, etc., etc. In Taoism, it's the sage will do this. The wise man will do this. So those are exemplar moral systems. But I've done a sort of superficial count of moral systems. There's about 14 of them. And exemplar systems are just one. So there are other moral systems. So, for example, in South Africa, we have the Ubuntu model system. Those of you who are computer nerds like myself would appreciate the significance of the Linux distribution Ubuntu, because it's about sharing with others, it's about community, it's about freely helping the community, and so on. So Ubuntu is I am because of the people around me. That's the saying. And what it is really is a social deterministic model of ethics. So you don't be a swine in society because society depends on you and you depend on society. You're one ecosystem. So it's a bit like nature. You don't pollute nature because you're in nature. You don't mess up with society by being a criminal or being a bad guy because you are part of society. You are society. So that's the sort of Ubuntu system. So that's a deterministic system. It's not a free will system. The free will system comes out of the Middle Eastern religions, and it's particularly prominent in the Christian faith, because the Christian faith relies on the fall of man doctrine, where Eve chose to eat of the fruit. Yes. And of course that's a complete failure, because on a compatibilist model of free will, she didn't choose. She didn't have the knowledge of consequences of eating that fruit. So she didn't have free choice. It's a bit like blaming a 2-year-old for stealing sweets. They don't know it's wrong. They'll do it. They'll definitely do it. Put the sweet on the table like God put the fruit in front of Eve. Of course she's going to steal it. She doesn't know it's wrong to steal it. So therefore she wasn't freely choosing to steal it. Therefore she was innocent. She only got the knowledge. She only got the knowledge of good and evil after eating it, right?
Yeah, belatedly.
Yeah.
There's been some good experiments on delayed gratification, hasn't there, with infants?
Yeah.
So, anyway, before I thank you very much and say good night to you, I'd like to just give a quick commercial to our audience, because next week we have Dr. Darrell Ray, who is a co-founder of Recovering from Religion Foundation. And In the near future, we've got agreement from the following people. In principle, we haven't got dates for them yet, but Chris Lintott, who is a main presenter of Sky at Night, you know, the world's longest running television program, started by Sir Patrick Moore, astronomer. We've also got agreement from paleontologist Mike Benton, who is at Bristol University, and has recently announced the discovery of a catastrophic event prior to the emergence of the dinosaurs. So not only did they...
I saw that research.
Yes, that's right, yes. So we haven't got a date for him, but he's agreed to come.
That's great.
Excellent.
I wonder
Wonderful.
I wonder if it's worth mentioning, but my alma mater, the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, is very famous for paleontology, and we've got a lot of researchers there who do the human origin stuff. So we've got an origin museum, and we've got the Sterkfontein caves, where you're looking at your hominids from 2 million years ago. And so most of the really ancient fossils are here in my home city.
It would be wonderful to get them.
Yeah, I must actually speak to them. The other thing that's worth mentioning, just for the sake of completeness for the audience, I don't think we've been up front, but so my research and my doctorate deals with philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion. So I have been giving a very sort of simplified version of what the arguments actually are. So if people do want to query and get more detail, they're welcome to look at my papers on academia.edu.
You send me your link, and I'll put them in the comments.
My computer's just run out of battery. So if you just Google me and put academia.edu in the search criterion, it should come up.
Brilliant. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, John.
Pleasure.
Now you can go and have that beer. I'm into my alcoholic one now.
It's actually more like sleeping pills time.
Okay, we'll take the rest of the day off.
Cheerio.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.